The Lavochkin La-7 emerged from the crucible of the Eastern Front, at a time when Soviet aviation was undergoing a desperate transformation. In the early stages of the Second World War, Soviet fighters such as the Polikarpov, Word-16, and early MiG and Yakovlev designs had been outclassed by the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and later the Focke-Wulf Fw-190. The Red Air Force required not only mass production, but also a fighter capable of parity or superiority against the Luftwaffe's best. The origins of the La-7 can be traced to the design lineage of Semyon Lavochkin and his team, whose earlier creation, the La-GG-3, had entered service in 1941. Built largely from laminated wood due to aluminum shortages, the La-GG-3 was underpowered, heavy, and unpopular with pilots, earning the unflattering nickname Lakirovani Garantirovani Grob, the varnished guaranteed coffin. Yet Lavochkin persisted. By 1942, the La-GG-3 was evolving into the La-5, equipped with the Shvetsov M82 radial engine. The La-5 marked a breakthrough, providing improved performance and earning the trust of frontline pilots. However, by 1943, the Luftwaffe had introduced improved Fw-190A variants, and the Soviet Air Force once again faced the prospect of technological inferiority. The strategic need for a more advanced fighter pushed Lavochkin's bureau toward the next iteration. Development of what would become the La-7 began in late 1943, building upon the La-5FN model. The La-5FN already incorporated the fuel-injected M82FN radial engine, which gave it better climb and acceleration compared to earlier versions. However, Lavochkin's engineers sought not just incremental improvement, but a decisive step forward. They aimed for reduced weight, increased structural strength, refined aerodynamics, and greater firepower. The design philosophy centered on refining the airframe. By 1943, aluminum was becoming more available in Soviet industry, and Lavochkin used this opportunity to replace wooden components with metal where possible. This reduced weight and improved structural rigidity. A new wing design with smoother surfaces reduced drag, and the airframe was recontoured for better aerodynamic efficiency. The cockpit canopy was redesigned to provide pilots with improved visibility, an essential advantage in dogfighting. Equally critical was the weaponry. Early La-5 fighters carried two 20mm Shvetsov cannons. For the La-7, designers experimented with fitting 3 cannons, significantly increasing firepower. This was vital for engaging heavily armed German aircraft, including bombers and the latest versions of the Fw-190 and Bf-109, which required concentrated bursts to bring down. By early 1944, the Lavochkin Bureau presented its refined prototype. At first glance, the La-7 retained the appearance of the La-5, but the details revealed extensive improvements. Lighter, more powerful, and more aerodynamic, it represented the culmination of years of incremental development driven by frontline necessity. For the Soviet Union, still recovering from the catastrophic early years of the war but now pressing westward after victories at Kursk and along the Dnieper, the La-7 promised to be the weapon that could challenge the Luftwaffe on equal terms. The aircraft's emergence was not simply a matter of engineering but of survival and strategic adaptation. It symbolized the ability of Soviet industry to evolve under pressure, to learn from battlefield losses, and to overcome the limitations of earlier designs. In the La-7, Lavochkin's team produced not only a machine but a statement that Soviet aviation could meet Germany's best and contribute decisively to the air superiority required for final victory in Europe. The prototype and testing phase of the La-7 marked the critical transition from an evolutionary design concept to a proven combat aircraft. The first prototypes were completed in early 1944, derived directly from the La-5FN, but with significant structural and aerodynamic changes. Engineers at Lavochkin's design bureau focused on reducing drag, enhancing power output, and refining pilot ergonomics. The prototype incorporated a re-engineered wing with smoother surfaces, better sealing of joints, and tighter tolerances in production. This attention to detail was unusual for wartime Soviet manufacturing, which often prioritized speed over precision, but it was essential for achieving performance gains. Test flights were conducted in the spring of 1944 at the LII, the Soviet Flight Research Institute near Moscow. Pilots immediately noted improvements in handling and speed. The La-7 reached a maximum speed of around 661 kilometers per hour at altitude, making it one of the fastest piston engine fighters in the Soviet arsenal. Its climb rate was significantly improved compared to the La-5FN, allowing it to match the Bf-109G and challenge the Fw-190A in vertical maneuvers. At lower altitudes, where much of the Eastern Front combat took place, the La-7 demonstrated particular strength, an advantage over German opponents whose performance peaked at medium altitudes. Yet the testing period also revealed difficulties. The M82FN radial engine, though powerful, was temperamental and required careful maintenance. Engine overheating was reported in early flights, particularly when the aircraft was pushed to its limits during climb tests. Cooling ducts and cowlings were redesigned several times before a satisfactory balance was achieved. Another problem lay in armament. While two Eschwach 20mm cannons were reliable, the addition of a third weapon increased weight and sometimes caused jamming during extended bursts. Engineers worked to improve synchronization and ammunition feed systems, but early production runs still faced reliability issues. Pilots from frontline units were invited to test the prototypes. Their feedback shaped the final adjustments before mass production. The improved canopy was praised, offering far better visibility than earlier Lavochkin designs, which had been criticized for restricting situational awareness. Flight handling was described as responsive and stable, particularly in low-altitude dogfights where quick reactions could decide survival. One pilot noted that the La-7 felt like an extension of the body, an impression that contrasted sharply with the heavy, sluggish reputation of the LAG-G3 only a few years earlier. The testing program also included comparative trials against captured German aircraft. Soviet engineers and pilots tested the La-7 against examples of the Bf-109G6 and Fw-190A4 obtained through capture or forced landings. Results showed that the La-7 was competitive in speed, maneuverability, and climb, particularly at low to medium altitudes. Against the Fw-190, known for its heavy armament and roll rate, the La-7 held its own by outturning the German fighter and matching it in acceleration. Against the Bf-109G, it demonstrated equal climb performance and superior handling in sustained dogfights. These trials confirmed that the La-7 could engage the Luftwaffe's frontline fighters on relatively equal terms, a vital factor in Soviet planning for future offensives. Transitioning from prototype to production was itself a formidable challenge. Soviet industry was still recovering from wartime dislocation, with many factories evacuated to the east. Precision manufacturing demanded by the La-7's refined aerodynamics strained production lines accustomed to simpler designs. Lavochkin's bureau worked closely with plant directors to implement tighter quality controls. Factories in Gorky and other locations began gearing up for mass output, with the first serial production La-7s rolling off assembly lines in mid-1944. The prototype and testing phase thus represented a pivotal achievement. It validated Lavochkin's vision, demonstrated that the Soviet Union could field a fighter equal to the Luftwaffe's best, and proved that incremental improvement from the LAG-G3 through the La-5 could culminate in a machine of true combat value. By the time production began, the La-7 had already earned its place in Soviet strategy as the fighter that could meet Germany in the skies over Eastern Europe during the final decisive years of the war. The La-7 entered operational service in the summer of 1944, just as the Red Army launched its largest and most decisive offensives against the Wehrmacht. Initial deliveries were made to elite fighter regiments, with priority given to Guards units that had already distinguished themselves flying the La-5FN. The Soviet Air Force intended not only to test the aircraft in combat, but also to ensure that the most experienced pilots would maximize its advantages. Among the first to receive the La-7 was the 176th Guards Fighter Regiment, which had already produced several heroes of the Soviet Union. This ensured that early combat evaluations came from pilots capable of providing detailed feedback under real battlefield conditions. Integration into squadrons proceeded quickly, aided by the fact that the La-7 shared much of its lineage with the La-5. Pilots transitioning from the earlier model required only a short period of familiarization, as the handling qualities were similar but improved. Ground crews also benefited from continuity, since many maintenance procedures remained consistent. Nonetheless, the more refined construction of the La-7 required greater attention to tolerances, and logistics officers had to ensure adequate supplies of spare parts, which were initially limited. The first operational sorties took place on the Eastern Front during the late summer campaigns of 1944. La-7s were deployed in support of Operation Bagration, the massive offensive that destroyed German Army Group Center and liberated Belarus. In these early missions, La-7 units flew escort for bombers, conducted air superiority patrols, and engaged Luftwaffe fighters attempting to resist Soviet advances. Pilots reported that the La-7 could successfully intercept FW-190s and Bf-109Gs, closing the technological gap that had previously favored German aircraft. The improved speed and climb performance allowed Soviet pilots to initiate combat on more equal terms. Combat trials quickly confirmed both strengths and limitations. The La-7 excelled in low-altitude engagements, where much of the air war on the Eastern Front was fought. In this environment, it matched or exceeded the performance of the FW-190IA and was competitive with the later Bf-109G and early Bf-109K variants. However, at higher altitudes, German aircraft often retained an advantage, particularly the Bf-109 with its supercharged Daimler-Benz engines. Soviet doctrine, already focused on low to medium altitude operations, adapted easily, and La-7 pilots were directed to exploit their strengths in the altitude band where they were most effective. Reactions from frontline pilots were overwhelmingly positive compared to earlier Lavochkin designs. Many noted that the La-7 was responsive, well-balanced, and powerful. Combat veterans who had flown the LAGG-3 and La-5 immediately recognized the progress achieved in just 3 years of development. One pilot described the transition as moving from a heavy machine to a true fighter. The canopy improvements, which offered a clear view in nearly all directions, were especially appreciated, as situational awareness often determined the outcome of aerial encounters. Military leaders also praised the aircraft, though with cautious realism. Reports to the Soviet Air Force Command emphasized that while the La-7 finally provided parity with German fighters, success in combat still depended on numerical superiority, tactical coordination, and pilot training. The aircraft could match its opponents, but it could not guarantee dominance on its own. Nonetheless, for the first time since the outbreak of the war, Soviet fighter regiments felt confident that their machines were not fundamentally inferior to those of the Luftwaffe. Losses in the early operational period were significant, but largely due to the intensity of combat rather than mechanical shortcomings. The La-7, though demanding in terms of engine maintenance, proved durable and reliable once ground crews adapted to its needs. Reports of engine overheating declined as modifications were introduced in production runs, and the aircraft developed a reputation for sturdiness in the field. By autumn 1944, the La-7 was increasingly visible across multiple fronts. Regiments equipped with the fighter participated in operations across the Baltics, Poland, and the Balkans. Their role extended beyond air superiority. La-7s also conducted strafing runs against German transport columns, railways, and troop concentrations, using their cannons to devastating effect. This versatility further enhanced their value to the Red Army, which required fighters not only to control the air but also to directly support ground offensives. The entry of the La-7 into combat thus marked a turning point for Soviet aviation. It symbolized the closing of the technological gap that had haunted the Soviet Air Force since 1941. For the first time, Soviet pilots entered combat with the confidence that their aircraft could meet German fighters on roughly equal terms. In doing so, the La-7 helped secure the air superiority that allowed the Red Army to sustain its relentless advance toward Germany in the final year of the war. The combat career of the La-7 reached its height in late 1944 and throughout 1945, as Soviet forces pushed deep into Eastern Europe and into Germany itself. The fighter became increasingly prominent in Soviet air operations, proving itself as both an air superiority platform and a ground attack asset. Its combination of speed, maneuverability, and heavy armament made it a formidable opponent, and it quickly earned a place alongside the Yakovlev series as one of the most respected Soviet fighters of the war's closing phase. One of the most famous episodes highlighting the La-7's effectiveness was its use by the 176th Guards Fighter Regiment, commanded by Ace Ivan Kozhedub. Already the highest-scoring Soviet fighter pilot, Kozhedub transitioned to the La-7 in 1944 and achieved many of his final victories in the type. Flying the La-7, he added dozens of kills to his record, including engagements against Bf-109s and Fw-190s, which he often dispatched in quick succession. Kozhedub's personal success demonstrated the La-7's potential in the hands of skilled pilots and served as powerful propaganda, showcasing the Soviet Union's ability to match the Luftwaffe not only through numbers but also through quality of equipment. On the front lines, La-7 regiments played a crucial role in securing air superiority during major offensives such as the Vistula-Oder campaign in early 1945. In these operations, La-7s were tasked with sweeping the skies ahead of advancing Soviet forces, ensuring that German air resistance could not disrupt the massive ground movements. They engaged in dogfights with Bf-109Gs and Ks, as well as Fw-190s of the ground attack units. At low altitudes, the La-7 proved highly competitive, often outturning its German adversaries and using its superior acceleration to gain advantage. Its heavy armament made short work of enemy fighters when accurate fire could be brought to bear. Beyond air-to-air combat, La-7s were employed against ground targets, taking advantage of their cannon armament to strike German transport convoys, supply dumps, and retreating formations. Although not designed primarily as a ground attack aircraft, the La-7's firepower allowed it to deliver effective strafing runs. Soviet commanders valued this dual capability as it allowed fighter regiments to contribute directly to the offensive momentum of the Red Army. In Poland, Hungary, and East Prussia, La-7s were frequently used in this role, softening enemy positions and disrupting logistical movements. The intensity of combat brought inevitable losses. While the La-7 had proven robust and reliable compared to earlier Lavochkin designs, it was still vulnerable to concentrated flak during ground attack missions, and German fighters remained dangerous opponents when encountered in numbers. The Luftwaffe of late 1944 and 1945 was heavily degraded, but units equipped with the latest Bf-109K and Fw-190D variants could still pose a challenge. In these encounters, pilot skill and tactical coordination often decided outcomes more than pure performance statistics. Tactically, Soviet doctrine adapted to make full use of the La-7's strengths. Fighter regiments often flew in mixed formations, with Yak-9s and La-7s working together to cover different roles. The La-7's speed and firepower made it well-suited for offensive sweeps, while Yakovlev fighters often excelled in escort and interception duties. This combination gave Soviet air commanders flexibility in planning missions and ensured that German air activity could be countered effectively. By early 1945, as Soviet forces advanced into Germany, La-7s took part in the final climactic battles of the war. They flew missions over East Prussia, Silesia, and ultimately Berlin, engaging the remnants of the Luftwaffe and clearing the skies for the Red Army's advance. In urban combat environments, La-7s also supported ground troops by attacking fortified positions, communication hubs, and convoys attempting to escape encirclement. The aircraft's reliability and power allowed it to maintain high sortie rates even in the chaotic conditions of the last battles. The combat record of the La-7 was not without setbacks. Technical issues, though reduced compared to earlier prototypes, still appeared in the field. Engine reliability remained a concern under harsh operational conditions, and spare part shortages occasionally limited availability. Moreover, while the La-7 could match or exceed German fighters at low altitudes, at higher altitudes it was still at a disadvantage against the latest German designs. However, these shortcomings did not outweigh the overall effectiveness of the aircraft, which consistently delivered results in the combat roles assigned to it. By the end of the war in May 1945, the La-7 had firmly established itself as one of the Soviet Union's premier fighters. It represented the culmination of years of development under desperate wartime conditions, transforming Lavochkin's design bureau from the creator of the poorly regarded LAG-G3 into the producer of one of the most respected Soviet fighters. In combat, the La-7 provided the Red Air Force with a machine that could finally stand on equal ground with its adversaries, contributing decisively to the air superiority that ensured the success of Soviet ground offensives. Its wartime record demonstrated not only the technical progress of Soviet aviation, but also the adaptability of its designers, pilots, and commanders in turning necessity into capability on the battlefield. The progression of the La-7 into multiple variants reflected the Soviet Union's continuous effort to refine and expand its fighter capabilities even during the final year of the war. While the standard La-7 already represented a major step forward from its predecessors, engineers at Lavochkin's bureau sought to address operational feedback and prepare the fighter for even broader roles. This process gave rise to experimental models, specialized configurations, and incremental improvements that extended the aircraft's relevance beyond 1945. One of the earliest modifications involved armament. Standard La-7s were equipped with two 20mm Schweiz cannons, each with 200 rounds mounted in the nose. Although this gave the fighter substantial firepower, Soviet engineers experimented with fitting 3 cannons for increased striking power against heavy bombers or well-armored opponents. Several 3-cannon prototypes were built and tested in 1944-1945. While they delivered impressive firepower, the added weight reduced performance slightly, and reliability issues with ammunition feeds limited widespread adoption. Nevertheless, some late-war La-7s entered combat with this configuration, giving them even greater destructive capability in dogfights and ground attacks. Engine development also played a role in the evolution of the La-7. The fighter's Shvetsov AS-82FN radial engine was reliable once production matured, but Soviet engineers sought even more power. A prototype known as the La-7R was fitted with a small rocket booster to increase speed during combat climbs or interception missions. Tests showed dramatic performance increases, but operational use was impractical due to short endurance and safety concerns. Similarly, experiments with installing more advanced radial engines were pursued, though the war ended before these could reach series production. These trials, however, laid groundwork for the post-war La-9 and La-11 series, which carried Lavochkin's designs into the jet age transition. Variants also included training and adaptation roles. A 2-seat trainer version of the La-7 was developed, intended to assist in transitioning young pilots from older aircraft to the high-performance fighter. While only produced in small numbers, it played a useful role in familiarizing new aviators with the La-7's demanding handling before frontline deployment. This was especially important in 1945, as losses continued and replacements had to be trained quickly to sustain operations across multiple fronts. Another area of adaptation was reconnaissance. Soviet planners recognized the need for fast, agile aircraft capable of penetrating enemy airspace and photographing targets. Modified La-7s were tested with cameras installed, though the Yak-9 and specialized reconnaissance aircraft often filled this role more effectively. Still, these attempts reflected the Red Air Force's pragmatic approach to maximizing the versatility of available designs. Post-war, the La-7 continued to serve in the Soviet Air Force for several years, though its frontline role diminished rapidly with the advent of newer piston engine fighters and early jets. Some La-7s were exported to Allied states in Eastern Europe, where they served briefly in national air forces during the late 1940s. In Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Yugoslavia, small numbers of La-7s supplemented domestic inventories, though they were quickly overshadowed by newer designs such as the Yak-9U and the first generation of Soviet jet fighters. From a technological perspective, the La-7 represented the peak of Lavochkin's wartime piston engine development. Each variant and modification demonstrated an effort to squeeze maximum performance out of the radial engine platform, a logical continuation of the La-5's lineage. The innovations tested on the La-7, 3-cannon configurations, aerodynamic refinements, improved cockpit design, fed directly into the design philosophy of later aircraft. In this way, the La-7 was both a combat machine and a testbed for concepts that would influence post-war Soviet aviation. Despite its short prime service life, the La-7 achieved significant results. By 1945, it had become one of the Soviet Union's most respected fighters, flown by elite aces and trusted for demanding missions. Its variants reflected both immediate wartime necessities and experimental ambitions, demonstrating the adaptability of Soviet designers even under extreme conditions. In the end, the La-7 was not just a fighter of the late war, but a bridge to the future, embodying the lessons learned in the struggle against the Luftwaffe while pointing toward the next era of aviation development. The legacy of the La-7 rests not only in its combat record, but also in the broader influence it exerted on Soviet and global aviation. Although it entered service late in the war and remained operational for only a short period before being overtaken by post-war designs, its impact was significant in several key areas: the morale of Soviet pilots, the technological trajectory of Lavochkin's design bureau, and the narrative of Soviet resilience in the air war over the Eastern Front. In terms of global impact, the La-7 had only limited export use compared to some of its contemporaries. Unlike the Yak-9, which was widely supplied to Soviet allies, the La-7 was primarily reserved for Soviet units during the war. After 1945, however, small numbers were transferred to the air forces of Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Yugoslavia. In these countries, the aircraft provided a stopgap measure until newer types, both Soviet and Western, could be acquired. In Czechoslovakia, for example, the La-7 served briefly before being phased out in favor of more modern aircraft, but it left an impression as one of the best Soviet piston engine fighters available. The influence of the La-7 on future design was more profound. It represented the culmination of Lavochkin's piston engine development, combining lessons learned from the LAGG-3 and La-5 with refinements in aerodynamics, armament, and pilot ergonomics. Many of its design features, streamlined surfaces, robust radial engine integration, and heavy cannon armament, were carried over into the La-9 and La-11 fighters of the immediate post-war years. These successors extended the Lavochkin line in the late 1940s, bridging the gap to the jet era. The La-7, therefore, can be seen as a transitional aircraft, marking the high point of Soviet piston engine design before the inevitable shift to jet propulsion. Culturally and symbolically, the La-7 acquired a special place in Soviet memory. It became associated with the triumphs of the final year of the war, when Soviet aviation had finally achieved parity with or superiority over the Luftwaffe. The fact that the highest-scoring Soviet ace, Ivan Kozhedub, achieved many of his victories flying the La-7 gave the aircraft an iconic status. Kozhedub's personal La-7, with which he recorded multiple kills, has been preserved and is displayed in museums, serving as both a historical artifact and a symbol of Soviet air power. In museums across Russia and Eastern Europe, surviving La-7s are presented as examples of technological progress under wartime pressure. They stand alongside Yakovlev fighters and lend balance to the story of Soviet aviation, highlighting the diversity of approaches taken by different design bureaus. For enthusiasts and historians, the La-7 represents the achievement of Lavochkin's team in overcoming early failures to produce one of the finest Soviet fighters of the war. The broader historical debates around the La-7 emphasize its role in shifting the balance of air combat on the Eastern Front. While it did not exist in numbers large enough to entirely dominate the skies, its presence in elite regiments during decisive campaigns gave Soviet pilots confidence that they could face German fighters without technological inferiority. This psychological factor was as important as its technical performance, reinforcing the momentum of the Red Army's final offensives. In the context of military aviation history, the La-7 stands as an example of how wartime necessity drives innovation. It was not revolutionary but evolutionary, a refinement that succeeded where earlier models had faltered. It showed that Soviet industry, despite resource shortages and the upheaval of war, could produce aircraft comparable to those of Germany and the Western Allies. Its short operational life did not diminish its significance. Rather, it underscored the rapid pace of technological change in aviation during the 1940s. Ultimately, the La-7's legacy is twofold. It was both a practical tool of victory in the skies over Europe and a stepping stone toward the post-war future of Soviet aviation. Its memory endures in the aircraft preserved in museums, in the records of the aces who flew it, and in the broader narrative of how the Soviet Union transformed from a nation initially caught unprepared for modern air combat into one capable of producing fighters that could compete with the best in the world. In this way, the La-7 remains Lavochkin's definitive answer to the Luftwaffe, a machine that symbolized adaptation, determination, and the final maturation of Soviet piston engine fighter design. Beyond its well-documented combat history and technical evolution, the La-7 also carried with it a series of lesser-known chapters that reveal the breadth of its role and the ambitions of Soviet aviation at the close of the war. While its frontline record against the Luftwaffe is central to its reputation, archival evidence and post-war recollections point to experimental uses, planned developments, and forgotten missions that shaped the aircraft's place in history. One such chapter was the La-7R project, which aimed to incorporate rocket-assisted propulsion. Soviet engineers, aware of German experiments with jet and rocket power, attempted to boost the La-7's speed through a liquid-fueled rocket engine mounted in the fuselage. Tests conducted in 1945 demonstrated impressive speed increases during short bursts, with velocities climbing above 780 kilometers per hour. However, the dangers of volatile rocket fuel, the complexity of maintenance, and the short duration of thrust meant that the La-7R was unsuitable for frontline service. Though abandoned as a combat project, it represented the Soviet effort to explore hybrid propulsion as a bridge to the jet era. Another lesser-known application involved the adaptation of the La-7 for research and training purposes. Post-war, some airframes were retained by test centers for high-speed flight studies. These aircraft were used to examine aerodynamic behavior near the limits of piston engine performance, data that proved valuable in preparing for the design of the first Soviet jet fighters. In this way, the La-7 served not just as a weapon of war, but as a scientific instrument, helping engineers understand airflow, stability, and control at higher speeds. The aircraft also had a role in operational tasks not typically associated with frontline fighters. In several instances, La-7s were used for escorting important transport flights, including missions carrying Soviet officials or critical cargo. Their speed and firepower made them suitable for this ad hoc duty, even though it was never part of their original design role. In addition, Soviet units sometimes pressed the La-7 into reconnaissance roles, fitting cameras into the fuselage for tactical photography. Though these modifications were limited and less effective than purpose-built reconnaissance aircraft, they highlight the versatility and adaptability demanded by wartime conditions. Forgotten missions also reveal the La-7's contribution to air defense. In 1945, as German jet fighters such as the Me-262 began to appear sporadically on the Eastern Front, Soviet command sought to position its fastest piston-engine aircraft as interceptors. La-7s were assigned to patrol zones near critical targets, tasked with engaging enemy jets where possible. Although the speed difference made interceptions extremely difficult, Soviet pilots reported several encounters, and the La-7's climb rate gave it at least a theoretical chance of intercepting jets during their vulnerable landing or takeoff phases. While no confirmed kills of jets by La-7s are recorded, their deployment for this purpose illustrates how the Soviets attempted to counter emerging threats. There were also unfulfilled plans to develop navalized or specialized ground attack versions of the La-7. Soviet planners considered adapting the fighter for carrier operations, anticipating the need for a modern piston fighter for potential naval expansion. However, the rapid advent of jet propulsion rendered such plans obsolete before they could be realized. Similarly, discussions of a heavily armored ground attack variant never progressed beyond the design stage, as the Il-10 and other dedicated aircraft already covered that role. Veteran accounts add further dimensions to the La-7's history. Many pilots recalled that the aircraft's responsiveness made it an excellent dogfighter, but they also remembered the difficulties of operating in harsh winter conditions. Engines were prone to cold weather starting problems, and the refined tolerances of the La-7's aerodynamic design demanded careful maintenance, a challenge on improvised frontline airfields. These recollections underscore the reality that even advanced aircraft remain vulnerable to the practical hardships of war. The unseen chapters of the La-7 story reveal a fighter that was not only a combat tool but also an experimental platform, a stopgap against emerging threats, and a versatile machine pressed into roles beyond its original intent. Though many of these missions and projects were forgotten in the shadow of its combat record, they testify to the broader context of Soviet aviation at the end of the war. A state determined to push technology forward, to adapt every available machine to multiple uses, and to prepare for the uncertain future of aerial warfare. In retrospect, these forgotten dimensions enrich the legacy of the La-7. They show that it was not just Lavochkin's answer to the Luftwaffe, but also a bridge into post-war experimentation and adaptation, embodying both the desperation and the ingenuity of Soviet air power at a decisive moment in history. The final legacy of the La-7 can be understood through the arc of its service life and the way it has been remembered in aviation history. While it emerged relatively late in the Second World War, its significance lies not only in what it achieved during its brief operational career, but also in what it represented. The maturation of Soviet fighter design under conditions of total war, and the ability of Soviet engineers to produce an aircraft capable of competing with Germany's finest machines. By May 1945, several hundred La-7s were in frontline service, flown by elite regiments across multiple fronts. They had contributed to the air superiority that allowed the Red Army to advance through Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and ultimately into Germany itself. In the skies over Berlin, La-7s escorted bombers, fought German fighters, and attacked retreating ground units. Their presence in these final battles marked the high point of Lavochkin's wartime achievements. After the war, however, the pace of technological development quickly shifted the La-7 from frontline status to obsolescence. Within only 2 years, the Soviet Union introduced newer piston-engine fighters such as the La-9 and La-11, which incorporated lessons from the La-7 but used all-metal construction and refined aerodynamics. More importantly, the dawn of jet propulsion rapidly eclipsed piston aircraft. By 1947, the MiG-9 and Yak-15 were already in service, and the La-7 was relegated to secondary roles or withdrawn from Soviet units entirely. Yet despite its short post-war career, the La-7 left a lasting mark. For many Soviet pilots, it represented the first time they could meet the Luftwaffe on equal terms without relying solely on numerical superiority. Its reputation was reinforced by the successes of pilots like Ivan Kozhedub, who achieved his final victories in the La-7, cementing both his status as the top Allied ace and the aircraft's reputation as a formidable combat machine. The association between Kozhedub and the La-7 has ensured that the fighter occupies a prominent place in Russian and Soviet aviation history. The aircraft also carried symbolic weight in the broader narrative of the Great Patriotic War. It stood as proof that the Soviet aviation industry, once crippled by shortages and reliant on outdated designs, had adapted and overcome. The transition from the much-maligned LAGG-3 to the La-7 within just 4 years exemplified the resilience of Soviet designers and industry under wartime conditions. In this sense, the La-7 became more than a weapon. It was a symbol of national recovery and determination. In historical debates, the La-7 is often compared with its contemporaries such as the Yak-3, Yak-9U, and late-model German fighters. While the Yak-3 was lighter and more agile, many pilots preferred the La-7's durability and firepower. Against the Bf-109G and K models, as well as the FW-190A and D, the La-7 proved competitive, though altitude performance remained a limiting factor. Western historians, analyzing captured examples and performance records, have generally agreed that the La-7 was among the best Soviet piston engine fighters of the war, though its late arrival restricted its strategic impact. Today, surviving La-7s are preserved in museums, most notably in Moscow, where Ivan Kozhedub's personal aircraft remains on display. These preserved examples serve as educational and cultural artifacts linking new generations to the history of the Eastern Front Air War. The La-7's presence in aviation museums and military commemorations underscores its dual identity as both a practical combat machine and a national symbol. In the broader trajectory of aviation history, the La-7 stands as the final expression of Soviet wartime piston engine design. It encapsulated the lessons learned from years of bitter struggle against the Luftwaffe and demonstrated how necessity drove innovation. Although quickly overshadowed by jet technology, its influence extended into the design philosophy of the early Cold War, where durability, heavy armament, and adaptability remained central features of Soviet aircraft. Ultimately, the La-7's story is one of both achievement and transition. It achieved parity for the Red Air Force at a decisive moment, contributed to final victory in Europe, and paved the way for post-war designs. At the same time, its swift disappearance from active service reflects the relentless march of technological progress. Remembered today through preserved aircraft, historical accounts, and the legacy of the aces who flew it, the La-7 endures as Lavochkin's definitive answer to the Luftwaffe and a testament to the ingenuity and determination of wartime Soviet aviation. Among the less publicized yet historically significant aspects of the La-7's story are the operational records and tactical doctrines that surrounded its final year of frontline service. By late 1944 and early 1945, the Soviet Air Force had reached a point where its numerical superiority was overwhelming, yet the Luftwaffe continued to field dangerous opponents. In this environment, the La-7 functioned as a cornerstone of Soviet tactical aviation, blending speed and firepower with practical battlefield roles. Detailed squadron reports from 1945 indicate that La-7 regiments were frequently tasked with mixed missions. In the morning hours, they flew patrols and intercept missions to ensure German reconnaissance aircraft could not penetrate Soviet lines. By midday, they shifted to bomber escort duty, often covering formations of PE-2 dive bombers or IL-4 long-range bombers attacking enemy transport and logistical hubs. Later in the day, they were used in ground attack roles, strafing retreating German columns or disrupting supply convoys. This versatility was central to their value, as Soviet commanders increasingly expected fighters to contribute to combined arms operations rather than limit themselves to air-to-air combat. At the tactical level, Soviet pilots developed maneuvers to exploit the La-7's strengths. Squadron leaders emphasized using its acceleration to dictate engagements, climbing quickly to intercept German fighters and then diving with superior speed to break contact when necessary. In dogfights, the La-7's tighter turning radius at low and medium altitudes often gave it an advantage over the FW-190A. Against the more nimble Bf-109G or K models, pilots were taught to rely on teamwork, coordinating attacks to overwhelm the German aircraft rather than relying on one-on-one duels. Records of air combat encounters during the Vistula Outer Offensive illustrate these tactics in practice. On multiple occasions, La-7 units successfully intercepted German formations attempting to cover retreating ground troops. In one engagement, a squadron of La-7s destroyed several Bf-109s while losing only a single aircraft, demonstrating the effectiveness of their tactics when executed by experienced crews. These reports also reveal the heavy toll of ground fire. Many La-7 losses in 1945 came not from German fighters but from concentrated anti-aircraft defenses. Pilots describe missions where entire sections of fighters returned with significant battle damage, their wooden structures scorched or punctured by flak, yet still airworthy enough to bring pilots home. Perhaps the most notable operational achievement of the La-7 lay in its role in securing Soviet air superiority in the final approach to Berlin. From March to May 1945, La-7 regiments flew hundreds of sorties daily, often from improvised forward airstrips just behind advancing ground forces. Their mission was to keep German aircraft grounded, preventing any significant interference with Soviet artillery and armor preparing for the assault on the city. In these final weeks, Luftwaffe activity was sporadic but dangerous, with late-model Bf-109s and FW-190s attempting desperate attacks. La-7 pilots claimed dozens of victories in these encounters, cementing the fighter's place as a reliable tool in the Red Air Force's arsenal. Operational records also highlight the human dimension of La-7 service. Many regiments were manned by veteran pilots who had flown multiple types during the war. Their transition to the La-7 was often accompanied by a sense of relief. At last, they had an aircraft capable of meeting German fighters on equal terms. Yet the constant attrition of war meant that inexperienced replacements continued to enter service. For these young pilots, the La-7's forgiving handling characteristics proved invaluable, reducing training accidents and allowing them to survive their first missions. Even as victory approached, technical issues persisted. Engine wear in late production La-7s, exacerbated by high operational tempo, sometimes forced regiments to ground aircraft for maintenance. Spare parts shortages were common, particularly for advanced components like fuel injection systems. Ground crews frequently cannibalized damaged aircraft to keep others flying, a practice that reflected both the strain of wartime logistics and the determination to keep squadrons combat-ready. In retrospect, the operational history of the La-7 illustrates the culmination of Soviet air doctrine during the war. It was not a perfect fighter, but it embodied the Red Air Force's emphasis on practicality, mass production, and tactical flexibility. Its deployment in multiple roles, air superiority, escort, and ground attack, reflected the Soviet philosophy of maximizing every asset to support the broader goal of decisive ground victory. By the time German forces surrendered in May 1945, the La-7 had proven itself as a dependable and respected weapon. Its operational record demonstrated that Soviet aviation had achieved both quantitative and qualitative improvements, ending the war on a level that would have been unimaginable in 1941. These final months of combat use ensured the La-7's place in the collective memory of Soviet pilots and commanders, as the aircraft that carried them through the last and most decisive campaigns of the war. The story of the La-7 concludes with its broader legacy, a combination of technological achievement, symbolic meaning, and its place in the trajectory of Soviet aviation history. While it was in frontline service for less than a year before the war ended, its impact extended far beyond those months. It embodied both the culmination of wartime piston engine fighter design and the starting point for the Soviet Union's transition into the post-war era of military aviation. At its core, the La-7 demonstrated the capacity of Soviet industry to overcome shortages, relocation of factories, and earlier design failures to create an aircraft equal to its adversaries. From the troubled LAGG-3 to the successful La-5 and finally the refined La-7, Lavochkin's design bureau exemplified adaptation under pressure. Each stage of development represented a response to specific battlefield conditions, culminating in an aircraft that could match the Luftwaffe's most advanced piston fighters. This evolution reinforced the Soviet model of iterative design, where practical improvements, tested under combat conditions, led to decisive results. In symbolic terms, the La-7 became associated with victory. It entered service at the moment when the Soviet Union was shifting from defensive survival to offensive dominance, and it accompanied Soviet forces all the way to Berlin. Its connection to celebrated pilots like Ivan Kozhedub, who became the highest-scoring Allied ace while flying the La-7, elevated the aircraft to iconic status in Soviet memory. Museums, war memoirs, and post-war commemorations often highlighted Kozhedub's La-7 as a representation of Soviet triumph in the air. This ensured that the aircraft remained a fixture in the narrative of the Great Patriotic War, remembered not as a transitional machine but as a symbol of final victory. Technologically, the La-7's legacy was transitional. It was the final step in the wartime Lavochkin piston engine lineage and served as the foundation for the La-9 and La-11, which carried similar design principles into the post-war years. These later fighters, with all-metal construction and improved range, extended the service life of the Lavochkin line well into the late 1940s, particularly in roles such as long-range escort and patrol. The experience gained in producing and operating the La-7 fed directly into these developments, ensuring that Lavochkin's bureau remained a central player until the advent of jet aircraft changed the industry completely. Culturally, the La-7 also left a mark in the way it was remembered compared to other Soviet fighters. The Yakovlev designs, particularly the Yak-3 and Yak-9, were produced in larger numbers and often reached a broader range of units. Yet the La-7, though less numerous, was regarded as one of the finest machines available to Soviet pilots. Its role in elite regiments and its association with the most famous aces gave it a prestige that outweighed its relatively limited distribution. For Soviet pilots, it was remembered as a pilot's aircraft, responsive, fast, and deadly, qualities that contrasted sharply with the derided LAGG-3 that had preceded it. Internationally, the La-7 did not achieve the wide export footprint of some contemporaries, but its presence in Eastern European air forces during the late 1940s served as an introduction to Soviet aviation for new Allied states. In countries like Czechoslovakia and Poland, the La-7 became a temporary symbol of Soviet support, even as it was quickly replaced by newer designs. For aviation historians outside the Soviet sphere, the La-7 became notable primarily through comparative studies, where it was acknowledged as a fighter capable of standing with the best late-war piston aircraft, such as the Spitfire Mk9 or P-51D Mustang, though optimized for the specific tactical environment of the Eastern Front. In modern times, the La-7 survives primarily through preserved examples in museums, historical research, and the memory of the pilots who flew it. Aircraft like Kozhedub's preserved machines serve as tangible reminders of the Soviet contribution to air warfare and of the rapid technological progress made during the war. In Russia and former Soviet states, it remains an object of commemoration during Victory Day parades and exhibitions, often highlighted alongside other iconic wartime aircraft. Ultimately, the La-7's legacy is one of transformation and closure. It transformed the reputation of Lavochkin's bureau from the producer of an aircraft nicknamed the Varnished Coffin into the designer of one of the finest fighters of the war. It also closed the chapter on piston engine fighter development in the Soviet Union, standing at the threshold of the jet age. In the annals of aviation history, the La-7 occupies a distinct position as Lavochkin's definitive answer to the Luftwaffe, a machine that not only met the challenges of its time, but also symbolized the resilience and determination of the Soviet Union in the climactic struggle of the Second World War.